Hi, everyone. My name's Kasia. I'm going to talk about ethical building in the age of AI. We'll take apart, like, word by word what I mean by those things. But before I get started, I would love to know a bit more about you all. So if you'll play a game with me, if you can raise your hand if you are a product manager. Wow, strong representation. OK, that's good. I'm a product manager, too. Safe space. How about an engineer? Ooh, one engineer. Yes, strong showing. Designer? OK. And then, sorry to do this, but to lump you all in the same. The ops side, like legal, finance, HR, marketing, cool. OK. I know that was unfair to put you all in the same bucket. So last question. How many of you have faced a situation where you find yourself doing some kind of task, and you're like, why am I the guy that's doing this task? Like, why is there nobody else? Yeah, OK, great, OK. So this will resonate. This is the situation I found myself in. In 2010, I was the head of product at a startup, and we were in the fintech space. We're building credit scoring algorithms using big data. That's what we called it at the time. Now we'd say AI, machine learning. And I was pretty new at being a product manager. I was new at fintech, and I was also kind of new in life. I was pretty young. And we had built our first algorithm, and we deployed it. It worked really well. And we didn't really know why it worked so well. And so I was trying to dig through how we actually built the thing that we built. And I said, what are all the variables that we're using? And can we look at the ones that are the most important? And they said, Kasia, there's like thousands of variables. And I was like, great. So which ones did we exclude because it was maybe morally or ethically contentious? I mean, we can't just use all of this data that we've just bought from this third-party source. And they were like, that's not our job. And I was like, OK, well, could you send me all the variables? I'm going to check them, because I don't know what other way to do this. And so they sent me all the spreadsheets. And I did the worst possible thing that you can do to a spreadsheet, and I printed it out. So I had these spreadsheets all on this table in front of me. I remember in the biggest boardroom, conference room that we had, which was small. We were a small company. And I had in one hand a red marker and in the other hand a yellow marker. And I was literally going through and saying, we should not be using that, and maybe we should investigate why we're using this. And really, it dawned on me at that moment that I did not know what my responsibility was as a builder of AI systems, and why it was that I was the one that was filling in these gaps, right, that I saw once the product was already built. So to take a step back, my name's Kasia. I'm a technologist. I'm currently advising a number of places. The largest client I have right now is the United Nations. I also run something called the Data Nutrition Project, which is a small nonprofit that does research, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And I've worked at a number of other places over the years. And over time, I've really started to focus more of my attention on why there are these gaps in the product development process. Why it is that people like me and people like you end up having to go through spreadsheets with a fine tooth comb and find things when maybe someone else should have done it, or why did it come all this way before it came to my desk, right? And what I've realized is it's not really a bug. It's more of a feature. It's a direct result of how we're actually building our products. So what I mean by this is that we generally optimize for growth. We build quickly to get things out so that we can increase the bottom line, or that we can stay in business if you're a small company, so we can meet our goals, right? This is not necessarily a bad thing by itself, right? But it's just kind of the way that product has been built over time. This is the way we do things. And it often means that we're building for one particular user at the expense of other users. So we'll be building for this 80% majority. And then there are these gaps in the process that fall outside this majority, right? Such as people who don't have a binary gender, or folks who have old phones, people who are living in rural areas, people who speak something other than English or multiple languages within the same sentence, so on and so forth. And so there are these gaps in the process. And at the point at which we're looking for gaps, sometimes it's a little bit too late. Right? We look reactively rather than proactively for these gaps. And that's also a function of how we actually build product. So generally, you start with a strategy. What is it that we're going to be building? Why do we want to be doing this, right? And then we design it. How are we actually going to do it? We start to develop, and we build the actual product. And then we test. We go through a compliance test. We bring it to marketing and comms, and they scream at us for not coming at them earlier, right? And then if everybody says, you're good to go, then we launch. The problem with this is that we're catching things really late in the process, and by the time we do catch them, it's really expensive to go back to the beginning and change it if there's something that's wrong. And because we're sometimes testing at the latest stage before it goes live, and there's a lot of pressure to go live, we might even be seen as anti-innovation by doing those safety checks. Right? So all of this is kind of set up in such a way that it's not only promotes these gaps in the process, but it makes it really hard to fill them. And the result here is that we have products that just don't work for everyone. These are two really recent examples. There's so many examples out there in the media that you'll find. The first one is voice assistants aren't bilingual, even though people are. And that's because mostly they're trained on monolingual data sets. And you also have these questions like, if we build our algorithms on historical people data, right, are they not just going to be as bad as the historical people were in terms of the bias and the discrimination? So we have these products that don't work for everyone because these gaps, right, can't be filled fast enough. And in terms of AI, these products are rapidly scaling to massive audiences. And I'm sure you've seen this chart. It's just how much time it took for all of these products to hit 1 million users. And ChatGPT, I mean, imagine if you're looking at Netflix, for example, that bottom line, it took a pretty long time to reach 1 million. And so if they're finding issues along the way, they can actually plug those issues as they roll it out and more people get on the platform. But with ChatGPT, it was kind of one and done, right? They're out there and now everybody's using it. So it's also a lot less time for people like you and me to fill those gaps. And it really falls to us to fill those gaps more quickly. Side note, if you use generative AI to create an image of a non-binary person sitting in front of a desk of spreadsheets, they don't know what to do with non-binary, right? So this is the kind of thing that even in making the presentation, I'm finding these gaps and thinking, how would I plug that? And why haven't they plugged these gaps yet? So I'm not trying to be doom and gloom here. I actually think that there are things we can do. I'm going to try to walk you through some of the ethical quandaries that I've faced in my career and the types of decisions that I made along the way. At the end, there's going to be time for questions, so save your questions. I'm happy to answer all of those. So there's kind of 3 buckets of ways that I've approached these ethical quandaries that I've faced. The first is pretty bold. I've done it a few times. We can refuse to build. Someone says, I'd like you to build a thing, and you say, I really disagree with that. And they say, no, I'd really like you to build a thing. And then you say, no, like, over my dead body, I quit. OK, a little extreme. But you can do that, right? And sometimes if you don't want to go all the way, you don't want to vote with your feet, as it were, you can redirect people, right, and build something different. The example I'll use here is, again, non-binary Kasia in a hoodie in front of a field of strawberries. In 2017, I joined the United States Digital Service. This is a startup inside the White House, and the goal is to bring in folks from the private sector, and sometimes also public sector, to do tours of duties, and you get deployed to failing government projects, and you try to fix them, and then you burn out and you leave. It's actually an amazing program. It's amazing. I would 100% recommend it. If you want to talk more about it, please let me know. I'm happy to chat afterwards. Because the total addressable population is really everyone, and that's something that you don't normally get if you're a product manager. In this case, I joined during a tumultuous time, and it was my decision to join. No one forced me to join. What I was seeing was that there was a lot of focus in the country on political issues, and there's a lot of polarization, and yet the government still has to run, and people still have to make technology, and that technology is going to affect a lot of people. And so I just wanted to be at the table when some of those decisions were being made. So when I joined, the first job that I was deployed to was with agriculture, USDA. And I kind of like looked at myself and I was like, are you sure you want to send me to peach farmers? I'm not sure I'm really the ideal person to be delivering this message. And they said, nope, you're the guy. And so I went. The problem statement was that farmers found it really hard to hire farm workers under a legal visa called H-2A, which is uncapped. And instead, most migrant farm workers, upwards of 90%, were coming into the country working under the table. This is very risky for them. It's not great for the economy, not good for the farmers, risky for them as well. And so they said, we would like you to fix this. And we have the solution already. Love when they do that. The solution is a mobile app. We just want to build this mobile app, it'll be kind of like Amazon. And I was like, oh God. So we can just make it really easy for a farmer to find a farm worker who's in the country legally. Oh my God, okay. So good people, heart's in the right place, want to solve the problem, want to make it easier to pick the strawberries, they don't pick themselves, I understand. But there are a lot of potential ethical issues with this. For example, in order to make this app, you'd have to know who is legal and therefore, by extension, who's not legal, and you'd make that publicly accessible in an app. That seems pretty scary. Second of all, you're creating essentially a dating app, sort of, like a marketplace, right? Where you've got people trying to find each other, but in this case, the power differential is huge. You don't want to do that. We've had things like that in this country before. They weren't apps. Let's not do it again. Well, also, when we did our investigation and we kind of looked into what was actually happening, this wasn't the actual problem. So in this case, we refused to build the app, but we suggested a different solution, which was actually data-informed. The real problem was, essentially, that a farmer had to apply 5 times for the same single farm worker with 5 different agencies. And the agencies were not sharing the information. So you're farming, you're a farmer. But then you're also filling in paperwork 5 different times with 5 different agencies, and they're not talking to each other. This is incredibly onerous. So we suggested they streamline the process. Less sexy of an answer, but ultimately a much better one. And they decided to take it up, and they're still implementing, but they are implementing. So this is the first answer, right, is you can refuse to build or you can try to redirect. I do want to mention, because I'm a responsible person, refusing doesn't always work, right? First of all, it's really helpful if leadership is supportive of what you're doing. At USDS, US Digital Service, they always told us, find the truth, tell the truth, we'll back you up, right? If you have a boss who's like, I'm not, you got to do what I tell you to do, the refusal is not going to work very well for you. Or maybe it'll work very well, but you'll be out of a job. If you can provide another path to success, even better if it's data-backed, that's a really good way to redirect and not do the thing that you think is ethically contentious. And if there's kind of internal goodwill and mutual respect, all of this goes easier. And like I said, sometimes you may end up having to quit. So the second thing is, let's say that you're presented with an ethical quandary and you don't know what you should do, you don't really want to quit, or you can't leave your job. That's a reality too. Like, we have to, be a part of society if we want to live here. What we can do is we can actually try to build better. So stay within the system, but build better. My example for this one, if we fast forward a little bit, is 2020. There were some things happening in the world. At this point, I was working at McKinsey. I was actually in the public sector work on healthcare. And at this point, I was helping states and federal governments as well figure out how to deploy the COVID vaccine. The problem statement in this case was that we wanted to identify potential racial equity issues with the distribution of the vaccine. And I'll just limit it to the US here for this example. And so this seemed like a really good goal, and I was down. We should try to figure out if everybody is getting equal access to the vaccine and getting equal access to services so that people can stay healthy and get better if they get sick. There were, though, some issues here in the actual implementation. People didn't want to give their personal information, not all people, to government entities or to medical practitioners for a number of reasons. So, as a result, race and ethnicity were optional in the collection of data. Mostly it was get the jabs in arms, or do the tests, or file the results, and if the racial data is there, awesome. If not, don't care. We're going to focus on the health data, which is the right answer. But this means that although people are able to get access to more services, 45% of the race and ethnicity data was missing at the beginning of the pandemic. So if you now have to use this data to identify potential equity issues, you are using partial data to make some really big decisions. What do you do? Now, in this case, I did not feel like we could refuse. That seemed like the wrong thing to do. And we had to start thinking in trade-offs. So you have missing data, and you've got 45% of that data is missing. Well, could we turn that into slightly better, but still very messy data? There's an algorithm that you can use called BISG. It's very common, I'm sure many of you used it. And it's a technique that predicts someone's race and ethnicity from their last name and their zip code. It's not awesome, right? I mean, my last name is Chmielinski, which is strongly Polish, right? Yes. But that's not how I racially identify, right? So if I actually run this algorithm on myself, it does not come out correctly, right? And I was the team that was helping to build this stuff. So we decided, though, that messy data, in this case, is probably better than just having missing data entirely. And so our decision was to use this BISG algorithm to get a sense, a general sense of what's happening, not to the letter, right? So we wouldn't publish these results at a high level, but to give us some ideas of trends of what was happening in the country. And that allowed us to do the equity analysis and to make program improvements. And at the same time, we had a second, well, it wasn't just our team, like everybody was really focused on how do we improve the collection of the data so that over time that missing data component goes down, right? And so in this case, it's really thinking about trade-offs and how to balance trade-offs based on the problems you're trying to solve. Now, if I kind of bring that up a bit to how this might change in a world in which we have a lot of AI, I would say at a higher level, instead of focusing in on the specific thing that's happening in front of you, taking a step back and thinking holistically about the product when it comes to identifying and mitigating issues. So with AI, you might be thinking, well, where are the gaps in the process? At what point can things go wrong? It's very helpful to think of AI as a life cycle. So the AI product isn't just what you launch at the end. It's the problem you're trying to solve. And then it's the data that you gather. It's the way you train the actual algorithm, the way you deploy it, and then the way that that deployed product actually affects the world. So I would recommend that if you are trying to build better, think about your AI products as a series of guiding questions all along this life cycle. And specifically, when you're building systems, I would recommend, first of all, ask, is this the right problem to address with AI, right? Can we address it with something else? Why is AI better than other solutions? Now, if we decide that AI is the right thing, right, can we figure out what's the training data? And what are the kinds of biases that are going to be encapsulated in the data itself that we want to make sure doesn't just get perpetuated in the final product? How are we going to test that the model is actually doing the thing we want it to do? What are the metrics? How are we going to measure fairness? How are we going to measure bias? How do we know that it's doing it well or it's doing it poorly? And this one kind of drives me crazy. We all are used to the idea that software should be updated. If our phones stopped pinging us every month with security updates, we'd be like, something's broken. I don't like the security updates as much as you do. It puts it out of commission for a whole night or whatever. But I expect it because I know that's the responsible way to be giving me technology, is to be updating it. We should have the same expectations, and we should build in the same way when we build AI. Once it launches, it's alive. That's the beginning of its life, not the end of its life. And finally, we really don't talk about it enough. When do we decide that it's time to sunset the product? Right? If I buy a printer, I haven't bought a printer for years. If I bought a printer, I don't expect the printer is still going to be functional on my desk in 50 years. Right? And the same thing should be true with the technology that we build and we deploy, that we buy, that we procure. How long does this actually work for me? At what point will I move away from it? Right? And these are the kinds of questions we should be asking ourselves if we want to build better. Okay, so I've gone through so far that when you're faced with problems in a product or a process, you can refuse to build, you can try to redirect, right? You can also try to build better by thinking holistically about the problem, by thinking about trade-offs. The final thing that I'll highlight here today is that in the case where you see a huge gap and you're not responding to something because there's nothing there, and no one's trying to do it, you can create it yourself. And I think we have a bunch of builders in the room, so you know this is possible because you're all building stuff today. And that brings me to the nonprofit that I run today called the Data Nutrition Project. This is the kind of stuff we were reacting to when we started this project. It started as a fellowship out of Harvard and MIT in 2018-19-ish. We were seeing headlines like this that were really, really focused on the problematic outcomes of AI systems. So these are situations in which, for example, Amazon created this hiring tool. It was based on historical resumes that had historical biases. And immediately, the AI system just started acting in the same biased way. Same with all these facial recognition systems that just don't work for certain populations. They weren't part of the training data sets. And same with various health models and discrepancies there. And we were sitting around one day, as you do when you're in academia, just eating like a lot of cookies and like drinking a lot of coffee. And we're like, you know, what's really missing here is that all of this has to do with how these things were trained. There's all this data that's coming in that's not good data. And yet they're building the system, and then the system does bad things that are evident in the data. And then they're like, oh my God, it's done bad things. And so, well, why didn't anyone ever look at the data in the beginning? And so we started digging around. And we realized that there are no standards for data. There are very few tools and kind of expectations around what data should look like and when it's good enough to be used, especially in AI systems. There are domain-specific data standards before somebody's like, no, like they do such and such. And yes, I know. But if you're looking across the board, there's really a crazy dearth in these kinds of standardized tools and approaches. And so we thought, well, if this is the AI model pipeline and people are catching all the issues, at the end, what if we introduce something like the cookies that we were eating? You know, on the back of the box of cookies, there's a nutrition label. What if we had a nutrition label for a data set? So before you actually eat the data, before your model consumes the data, you can see what's in it. You can make some better choices. And so that's what we decided to build. We built the dataset nutrition label. The first version was a prototype. It was very quantitative. And we published a white paper, and then the fellowship ended, and we're like, okay, see ya, nice to know you, we'll catch up like every once in a while on Zoom. And we kind of went back to our lives, but then people kept calling us and saying, well, where's this nutrition label? I want to use it. And so we got the band back together, and we ended up incorporating as a nonprofit in that time zone that was the pandemic. That's just like one long year in that time period. And we came out with the second version, which was very qualitative, because what we heard from folks was, I don't want something quantitative, I can do that myself. What I need is all the qualitative information about the decisions they made along the way. So we said, okay, we'll make it super qualitative. We'll call out all the various potential biases, a gender bias, a racial bias. And then it turned out, if you just keep telling everyone their data's terrible, they don't want to work with you. So we had a third version that we launched last year. And this one's kind of a combination of the two, and it's more focused on a standardized design that's easy to read, easy to parse, and gives a data practitioner the kind of information that they need to make better choices. This information includes things like at-a-glance badges that tell you if it's about people or if it's gone through technical or ethical review. Also kind of this 2x2 about intended use. So why was the data initially created? What's it intended to be used for? How has it been used? How should it not be used, right? All these kinds of things that are really important. One thing I'll call out is that there is no score, because it turns out that there's no way to tell you that a data set is objectively A+ or an F-, maybe an F-. You might be able to say F-. But it really depends on what you're trying to do with it, right? If I have a data set that's all people's information about their heart health in Hong Kong, and then I want to build some kind of an ER model that's looking to triage, and it's going to be deployed in the middle of the US on a totally different population that eats totally different food in a completely different climate, that's not a good data set for my purpose. But if I'm an ER doctor in Hong Kong, and that is the data from my patients historically, that is an excellent data set to use. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't also include other representation in all of this, but that's a good place to start. So it's the same data set that's useful in one context and not so useful in the other. And so this is the kind of thing that we do. We put out this label. There's a tool called the Label Maker. Everything's open. You can take a look and play with it and see if you want to use it. And as we put this out there, a lot of folks did want to use it. And so we've partnered with a number of organizations to change their internal methodologies, help them maybe update their own, or to lend them ours if they want to use it. And it's been quite a ride. Now, while we've been doing that, we've realized that the label itself is a pretty amazing educational tool. When you have to make a label as you are making a data set, or even at the end, you realize, oh, there are all these decisions that I should have made along the way. And so we also end up publishing and educating people around the importance of transparency in AI systems, starting with the data. So we talk to policy folks, and we go do little academia tours and talk to students, and we also publish papers and try to work with others in the field. I should mention, we're not the only ones. There are a number of amazing folks out there who do data sheets and data cards, model cards, system cards, you name it. There's a ton of documentation projects, and we all know and love each other. So I'd say the thing I'm most proud of, though, is that the folks that we have worked with have realized that this is really a Trojan horse for better data, period. So we put the label on the data set, and that's fantastic. It makes it easier for people to find the data and use the data. But the folks whose data it is that we're labeling, they make different choices about the data because they know that we're going to put a label on it. Like, for example, if I were like a candy manufacturer, maybe in the next life I'll do that. It sounds way more fun. And I know I have to put a label on the candy bar at the end. I might make some different choices about the ingredients along the way. And so that's what this partner said. She said, there's a doctor at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is a cancer center, and she said, I know the primary mission of DNP is to make it easier for those who are finding data, but it's also improved my data set design moving forward. And if you want more information, I just threw a QR code on here. I know they said, put a QR code. Okay, there's a QR code. But you could just Google it too, Data Nutrition Project, if you want to learn more about that. So I've kind of walked through, at this point, 3 major ways to deal with these ethical questions that we face as builders. One is just you can refuse, right? It might cost you. It's a little better if you can redirect. But I think that's a really strong option. And I don't want to minimize it. I think it's really, really powerful. The second is you remain within the system that you're in and you try to build better, right? You try to get smarter about identifying gaps and figuring out how to fill those. And the third is that if you don't see the thing that you want in the world, you can go out and you can create it, like what we did with the Data Nutrition Project. So, in closing here, there's always going to be a number of dangerous gaps in technology, and humans will have to fill that. So there's, 2 things here, right? We're never going to get rid of all the gaps. It's not possible. So that's not the goal. The goal is to really identify the gaps and figure out how to start to fill them. And also, we can't automate it all away. I really don't see a situation in which we're going to have the machines that are, auditing and controlling the other machines and keeping them all honest. I think there will be a human at some point, might be higher up in the chain, right? But this is always going to be the scenario. We have these opportunities to refuse, to redirect, to build better, or to create new solutions. And if we do this, I really do think we can make technology that works better for everyone. Thanks so much. I think I'm supposed to say that you can ask questions. Yes? Here, and then there's someone here.
Hey, thanks so much. Is that better? Hey, thanks so much. Could you speak a little bit about the pull and push of needing to get an MVP out, but also not wanting, in rushing it, to get something in front of people and to test it, to make any of those mistakes that we talked about that doesn't properly serve folks? How do you bear in mind the tension between one-way and two-way doors that early in the design and prototyping?
Wait, hold on. Let me keep the mic for a second. Just want to make sure I understand. So your question is, in the user testing flow,
right,
how you start to consider some of these things about rushing. And
so a good example of USCS doing this well is IRS direct file is not available in all states, right? Because it's too complicated to nail all states at once. A bad example of it might be excluding people that need to use a screen reader or something like that. If you have comments or thoughts on that, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. How much time do you have? No. There are some components of the product build process that I really do think have to change. I didn't really get into that here because I'm just assuming that we live in this world. But if I were able to radically change it, I think there are some things that I would, and they would get specifically to that kind of question. The first is that I think we really need to co-design with communities. And that is hard because sometimes you're building something that people don't even know that they want, for example, or that they need, but they know what the problem is, right? So you can always start with the problems. Sometimes it's really tough to get representation, and it might feel extractive because you're working with communities and then they don't get anything for it, and then you've just, taken their information and their lived experiences, and you have to be responsible with that. But I do think that the earlier that we can be involving folks in the actual creation and the design of the use case and the strategy, the better. And this means that you also need to have representation inside your teams. I think a lot of organizations are starting to do advisory boards too. So that can be a panel, and you can compensate people. This is really important. People have to see value. Either you're creating products that work for them and that's the value, and you should pay people for their time, right? Especially if you're asking folks who have a very different socioeconomic level where they can't just take off from work and come hang out with you for an hour in your cool headquarters to tell you about their problems. I mean, they have to actually do things, right? So I think compensation and real integration is important. I think there's also an approach that I would recommend folks check out if you haven't already, called design from the margins. And that's this notion that, that diagram I showed you with the bell curve, we're designing for the middle, right? And then we move into the margins. What happens if you actually design for the margins, right? And it turns out that in a lot of cases, when you design for the margins, it gets better for the middle. And I'll give you an example that's, it's not really like not safe for work, but it's, So a friend of mine works on this project, Design from the Margins. It's called Decenter now. They've turned into a nonprofit. And they were hearing that folks were getting stopped in various places in the Middle East. Their phones were being taken, looked at by police, and if they saw the Grindr app, they'd be harassed or arrested. And this is like a dating app, like a hookup app in the queer community. And so this is obviously really dangerous and really terrible for people. And so my friend worked with, the Decenter folks worked with Grindr, called them up and said, you've got a problem. There's a major gap here, and it's not just like a gap that's neutral. It's actually a harmful gap. And they worked together to make it so that in the app, you can actually select any generic icon. So you could just have, instead of the Grindr icon, you could have just a calculator or a calendar. And that made it possible for folks to essentially hide that they had this on their phone, or make it a little bit harder. And they rolled this out in the MENA region, and it was very popular, and people were grateful. But then they realized, like, hey, a lot of people don't want that app on their home screen, or very visible if they're just on the subway or something, right? It'll out them, or they just don't, it's like their private business, no one needs to know. And so they rolled it out to everybody. And it turned out that designing for the margin actually helped a lot of people who were in the middle. And so I think, this is the longest answer ever, but in terms of meaningful representation and kind of meaningfully including people in the process, it's about thinking about this from the design, working with people, and maybe even recentering your thoughts as to which is your ideal audience and your target user.
All right, when we talk about training models, I'm not coming at this as an AI expert, but when I think about educating people, we often need to teach with context, and that context is sometimes negative. It's hard to teach the history of certain wars without teaching the discriminatory factors that led to it. So when training a model, how do we handle the need to give it context while segmenting that data so it uses it in a negative way, what not to do, so that the model can better understand what to do. Self-analysis is something that we as humans do all the time. When I look at how my parents handle finances, I've learned from them what not to do, as opposed to what to do. How does that fit into the AI world?
Yeah, these are great questions. Depends on what kind of AI you're building. So there are certain actual mathematical techniques, right? So reinforcement learning or various kinds of structures that you can be testing and optimizing for, where you say, give it a try, and then actually the right answer is this, try it again. Or just try over and over again until you achieve some kind of goal that I've set for you. And so you can kind of mathematically, depending on the type of AI, I'm assuming you don't just mean generative AI, which seems to be what people mean now, but there's a lot of different kinds of AI. And so there are ways that you can kind of give the system rules and ask them to follow the rules. I think the hardest thing, though, about the bias and discrimination, the fairness kind of a conversation, is that the hard part is not the technical part, it's the human part. It's how do we decide what is fair? And what's our definition of something that's discriminatory? That's going to depend based on your context, your social context, geopolitically, right? The language you speak, like all of these cultural differences. We're going to have different human interpretations of what the system should do. And if we know definitively what we want the system to do, we can then mathematically find a way to make it do that. I'm not minimizing it. It can be very technically difficult, but we have to have a clear idea of what we're actually trying to achieve. And that, I find, is the hardest part.
When you're applying a label, not a score, but a label to a data set to say that maybe this has been trained on discriminatory content,
Yes.
How would you as a reviewer look at this need for maybe training on discriminatory content as a negative benchmark so that the model can move past that? The inclusion of this may not be negative, it may not be a bad thing, and how would that affect your score? Or maybe I simply misunderstand AI models, so that's possible too.
No, you're good. Right, so we don't tell someone to use the data or not to use the data. We just want everyone to have the information before they decide to go in there and use it. And we want the folks who are responsible for the data set to impart whatever knowledge they know about the specificities of that data, right, to the people who are going to be using it so they can make the best choices. We made a decision really early on that we were not building this and designing this for bad actors, because bad actors are always going to find a way to do bad things. We're designing this for folks who want to do the right thing. It's just really hard to do the right thing right now. And that might change over time, but that's kind of the approach that we've taken. An example, a lot of this also has to do with vocabulary. So an example would be, we built this label with a really nice professor, a really kind guy. He had spent 10 years making a data set, and he was really proud of this data set. And I, of course, very low social intelligence. I was like, so, Professor so-and-so, what's wrong with your data? And he was like, Kasia, there is nothing wrong with my data. Oh, God. Okay, so he was like, there is nothing wrong with it. I've spent so much time on this. It's perfect. We've fixed all the issues. There's no such thing as a perfect data set, though. I know this. And so I was like, OK, thank you so much. We're going to go back and review this. We'll come back and talk to you next week. OK, next week comes back around. I'm like, all right, let me try this again. Professor so-and-so, let's say that somebody who did not spend 10 years on this data set wants to use this data set. What are the tips that you would give this person to use the data set well? Oh, my goodness. It's like the door was like flung open. He's like, oh, OK. We didn't have surveyors for these 5 years. We missed this entire part of the country. But then we imputed that data by taking the next 5 years and backfilling for the 5 years that we were missing. There was a catastrophic flood in this area at this point, so we couldn't do it. And it was like, this is what I was trying to get with the question. But of course, if you say, what's wrong with your data, no one's going to answer you. Right? And so I think it's kind of, when you're talking about context, you're talking about how do you actually flag things that are useful for folks. A lot of it has to do with figuring out what the real questions are, what you're trying to get at, trying to understand how they're actually trying to use the data, what the system that they're building is intended to do, and then having a conversation about it. Unfortunately, it's not just like a checklist, unfortunately. I wish it were. This person's had their hand up for a while. Yes. Yes, so the glasses, yeah. The sunglasses.
The sunglasses. I'm curious on your thoughts on something. What are your thoughts on just introducing Gen AI LLMs to the general public when they were introduced?
It's like, maybe I ran out of time, that'd be excellent. Well, you're kind of talking about the user interface, I think, right? ChatGPT.
I'm thinking just the ethics of the user interface, yeah.
Yeah, because the actual math that underlies LLMs was published in 2017, so it's already 7 years old. So it's not necessarily new math. What it is it's what happens when you apply massive compute and massive data sets, and you do that with this math. This is kind of what you get. It's like these emergent qualities. And then I think that the UX, right, the interface, brought it into the consumer perspective really quickly. What do I think about the ethics of it? I feel many things. I think that I personally believe that the companies have way more responsibility to explain what they trained these machines on. The data question obviously is very close to my heart, so I come at it first from a data question. And all of these kind of emergent qualities and capabilities and the cultural nuance and all of this is not magic. It comes from how it was trained. And so when you're looking at the proprietary proprietary models in particular, though some of the open source as well, it's not clear what data it was trained on to this day. So OpenAI has never said what the data is. They don't explain to you where it came from. There's very high level information about any kind of cleaning or safety processes or filtering that happens. I think it was Llama 2 in their documentation. There's like a paragraph on data and it says, we filtered for PII. Oh, great. Filtered what? And how did you do it? And what was the test? And what were your metrics? And your, what were the results? Is anything quantifiable there at all? And so I think that, there are many components that you could kind of dig into in terms of the ethics. I think it's an exciting product. And I think in terms of it bringing a lot of benefits, it has. I think people are really creative with it. It's been fun to see what people do with it. But considering the breadth and I think the power of these, there definitely could have been more information that was given to us, or at least researchers, about how they train these models and how they worked. It definitely feels like it's a race to get something out faster, and the same with the data collection. It's like, collect everything you can, and then one day there'll be regulation, and by then we'll already have it all, right? And that's what it feels like. It feels like things are really, really fast for the purposes of innovation as opposed to safety or trust or any of these kinds of things. Purpose. Or purpose, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Your talk reminded me a lot of design justice. I see a lot of things coming out of that book and what you're saying, which is awesome. Everybody, I recommend you read that book. That book is fantastic. I have two questions. The first one is, we are damaging the environment and the earth with these gigantic LLMs. Everybody's talking about this, and it's like this oxymoron of like, wow, there's all this potential even to use this in an equitable way, but then you're causing huge amounts of harm in doing that, and it's like this huge dichotomy, I guess. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. I know like Dr. Timnit Gebru and others are talking a lot about this. And then the second one is, you talked about, how do we do co-creation in a way that is also compensation and ethical. And when you think about like another aspect is like red teaming, and how do we test, particularly like with LLMs, right? Like how do we test these LLM systems to make them more operating in a more equitable way, and how do we do that in an equitable way? So those two questions. Thank you.
Great. So the first, you're going to have to remind me. First question, give me the keyword for first question.
First question was about the damage that...
Damage, environmental, yes. I immediately blacked it out because obviously it's a painful subject. I recently heard somebody say that it was not a good use of an LLM to ask where the nearest Starbucks is. And I think this is like the problem encapsulated, is that when you make things so cheap and easy and free, and there's a massive expense behind it, which is resource intensive, environmentally intensive, all these things, people don't realize it or they don't care. It doesn't actually matter to them. And they'll do something like, instead of going to Google Maps and searching for or looking out their window, because there's Starbucks everywhere, right? They'll literally go to an LLM and they'll use some massive amount of energy to query into a tool that doesn't even give it the right answer, right? So I think that, yes, the systems themselves are massive, and I have a lot of hope for smaller LLMs, so kind of small models, and the reduction in resource use. But that aside, in terms of I think there's also a component of how people are using these systems and the training and the education that needs to go into awareness that when you generate an image, that's like draining a cell phone battery. And is that worth it, right? And maybe not even allowing people to make the trade-off, but making trade-offs higher up in the chain. Now, the flip side of that is that there's digital divide, and you want to make sure that not just the people who are the richest can access the cool technology. So I think that these are really complicated issues. But certainly, I think that the environmental impact is huge, and that's the kind of thing that we've actually considered making different labels for LLM data sets that somehow also capture the environmental intensity of using them. Because we figure the first thing to do is transparency and disclosure, to understand the impact of this, and then from there you can start to have other, other implementations of change. Second question keyword? Red teaming, and trying to do that fairly. Man, that's a tough question. So the idea behind red teaming is that you take a model that's already built, and then you basically you identify a red team, like blue team, red team, and the red team tries to go and break the LLM. And in doing that, surfaces the issues that then can go back to the company, and they can try to fix those issues. And so I do think that representation in red teaming is very important, because almost by definition, the folks who are red teaming are going to find issues that they know about, right? So you want to get as broad representation as possible. I know there are some great organizations, Raman Chowdhury's organization, Humane Intelligence, I think, is working with the government to try to create red teaming exercises that are really broad. I think this is the kind of thing, is public participation and maybe a tie into public digital infrastructure, right? Bringing some of these things out to a broader base so that we can get representation. But it's a really good question.
And that is all we have time for. Thank you so much, Kasia. It's been fantastic.